I never thought I'd be sitting in my own living room holding an email that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. My name is Richard Cole, and for 30 years, I built a life most men only dream of. I worked my way up from a junior analyst to senior partner at one of Boston's most prestigious investment firms. I raised 2 children, supported my wife's every dream, and along the way, I made some very smart property investments that secured our future. But on that cold February morning when I opened that email from my daughter-in-law, Jessica, I realized that everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd built, meant absolutely nothing to the people I loved most. Welcome to the Mental Grand, where today I'm going to tell you about the day my own family tried to erase me from my own legacy and how they learned a lesson they'll never forget. The email was casual, almost cheerful. Jessica had organized a family reunion trip to Lake Tahoe for spring break. There were hotel reservations, activity schedules, dinner plans at expensive restaurants. My son Marcus, my daughter Emily, their spouses, and my 4 grandchildren would all be there. It looked perfect, like something out of a travel magazine. Then I reached the bottom of the email, and my coffee went cold in my hand. The guest list was right there in neat little bullet points. Marcus and Jessica, Emily and her husband Tom, the 4 grandchildren, and then, at the very end, a line that made my chest tighten. Unfortunately, due to limited space and budget constraints, we've had to make some difficult decisions about attendance. We know you'll understand, Richard. This trip is really more for the younger generation to bond with the kids. I read it 3 times. Then I opened my laptop and looked at the property deed I'd been reviewing just the week before. The cabin they'd selected for their hotel wasn't a hotel at all. It was my private mountain retreat, the 3-acre property with the custom-built lodge that I'd purchased 15 years ago as an investment and family gathering place. The place where we'd celebrated every major holiday for over a decade. The place where my grandchildren had learned to ski, where we'd had birthday parties and anniversary dinners. They were planning their family reunion at my property, and they'd uninvited me from it. I sat back in my chair, and something shifted inside me. For months, I'd been feeling it. The subtle distance from Marcus, who'd become cold and dismissive after he married Jessica 3 years ago. The way Emily had started treating me like an outdated relic whose opinions didn't matter anymore. The whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a room. I'd told myself I was being paranoid, that this was just part of getting older, of children building their own lives. But this email wasn't subtle. This was deliberate erasure, and it was coming from my own blood. That's when I realized they had no idea who they were messing with. I didn't respond to the email right away. That's one thing 30 years in investment strategy taught me. Never react in anger. Always respond with precision. Instead, I made a phone call to my attorney, James Whitmore, a man I'd known since law school and who'd handled every major legal matter in my life. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in his downtown office with the property deed, the email printed out, and a question that would set everything in motion. "James," I said, sliding the papers across his mahogany desk, "I need you to tell me exactly what my options are here, legally speaking, and I need you to help me send a message that will be remembered for a very long time." James read through everything with the careful attention that made him one of Boston's top attorneys. When he looked up, there was something almost like sympathy in his eyes, mixed with the sharp intelligence of a man who understood exactly what was happening. "Richard," he said slowly, "this is one of the clearest cases of family entitlement I've seen in my career. They're treating your private property as if it's a public resource they can access at will, while simultaneously excluding you from the gathering. Legally, you have every right to deny access, revoke any standing invitations, and, if necessary, pursue trespassing charges if they show up anyway." I nodded, but I wasn't interested in criminal charges. That wasn't the kind of justice I wanted. What I want, I told him, is for them to understand what they've taken for granted. I want them to learn that respect isn't optional, that family means something, and that you don't throw away the people who built the foundation you're standing on. James smiled then, the kind of smile that told me he understood perfectly. Then we're going to need a very specific strategy, and we're going to need documentation of everything. Over the next week, I did something I'd never done in my entire career. I investigated my own family. I went through financial records, property access logs, email chains, text messages that Marcus and Emily had sent me over the past 2 years. What I found broke something inside me that I didn't know could break. They hadn't just been distant, they'd been actively planning to push me out of family decisions for over 18 months. There were group chats I wasn't included in, financial planning meetings about my estate that they'd held without me, conversations about how I was getting difficult in my old age and needed to step back from being so controlling. I'm 62 years old. I run a division that manages $2 billion in assets. I mentor junior analysts who go on to become industry leaders. I sit on 3 nonprofit boards, and I've been asked to speak at economic conferences around the world. But to my own children, I was just an obstacle, an outdated authority figure who needed to be managed and eventually moved aside. What happened next changed everything. I called a meeting at my downtown office with Marcus and Emily. I told them I wanted to discuss some estate planning matters, which got their attention immediately. Nothing motivates adult children quite like the prospect of inheritance discussions. They showed up on a Wednesday afternoon, both of them dressed in their business casual clothes, Marcus with his confident swagger and Emily with her cool professional demeanor. They thought they were coming to hear about trust funds and property transfers. They had no idea what was actually waiting for them. I started with small talk, asked about the kids, about their jobs. Marcus works in marketing for a tech startup. Emily is a middle manager at a pharmaceutical company. Both good careers, both doing well, but neither of them had ever experienced the kind of strategic pressure I was about to apply. Then I opened a folder on my desk and slid a document across to each of them. "Before we discuss any estate matters," I said calmly, "I'd like you to read this. Take your time." The documents were detailed financial analyses I'd prepared showing every dollar I'd invested in their lives. College tuitions, law school for Emily, MBA program for Marcus, down payments on their first homes, the seed money for Marcus's failed restaurant venture 5 years ago, the loan I gave Emily when Tom was out of work for 6 months, car payments, insurance premiums, wedding costs, even the money I'd quietly transferred when I knew they were struggling. All of it. Itemized, dated, and totaled. Marcus's face went pale. Emily's jaw tightened. The total came to just over $800,000, not counting interest, not counting the countless other ways I'd supported them that couldn't be measured in money. "Now," I said, keeping my voice level and professional, "I want to talk about respect. I want to talk about what it means to be a family, and I want to talk about a certain email regarding a trip to Lake Tahoe." I watched them exchange glances, that quick look of 2 people who've been caught but aren't quite sure how bad it is yet. "Dad," Marcus started, but I held up my hand. "I'm not finished. You're going to sit there and you're going to listen, and you're not going to interrupt me, because if you do, this meeting ends, and the next time we speak, it will be through attorneys." The threat hung in the air like winter frost. I'd never spoken to them this way before. I'd always been the understanding father, the patient supporter, the man who solved problems and asked nothing in return. But that man had been taken advantage of for the last time, and they were about to learn what happens when patience runs out. I opened another folder and pulled out property deeds, 5 of them. "Do you know what these are?" Neither of them answered. "These are the properties I've acquired over the past 20 years. The Lake Tahoe Lodge, where you're planning your little family reunion. The beach house in Cape Cod, where you've spent every summer for the past decade. The investment property in Vermont that I've been letting Marcus use for his weekend ski trips. The condo in Miami, where Emily has taken 3 vacations in the last 2 years. And the commercial building downtown, where, coincidentally, Marcus's startup rents office space at about 30% below market rate, courtesy of a deal I arranged with the building owner, who happens to be a former client of mine." I let that sink in for a moment, watching the realization dawn on their faces. Every single one of these properties exists because I worked 80-hour weeks for 30 years, because I made sacrifices you'll never understand, because I believed in building something for my family, and you repay me by uninviting me from my own property, by treating me like I'm some burden you need to manage. Stay with me because what happens next is something every parent who's ever felt undervalued, dismissed, or taken for granted needs to hear. And if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed to the Mental Grand, because we're just getting to the good part. Emily found her voice first. Dad, that email wasn't meant to be hurtful. We just thought that maybe you'd be more comfortable at home. The trip is going to be really active, lots of skiing and hiking, and we didn't want you to feel pressured to keep up with. I cut her off with a look. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending this was about my comfort. I reviewed the email chains, Emily. I know about the group chat where Jessica called me exhausting and said this trip would be so much more relaxed without me there. I know, Marcus agreed and said I've been too controlling about family events. Marcus's face flushed red. You went through our private messages? The indignation in his voice would have been funny if it wasn't so tragic. I went through communications that involved me and my property, I corrected, and I found exactly what I suspected: a pattern of disrespect, dismissiveness, and entitlement that's been building for years. I stood up and walked to the window overlooking Boston Harbor. Here's what's going to happen. First, your trip to Lake Tahoe is canceled. I'm having the locks changed on the property today, and the caretaker has been instructed that the Cole family does not have access until further notice. Second, the beach house will be closed for the season. Third, Marcus, you have 60 days to find new office space because I'm terminating the arrangement that's been saving your company $6,000 a month. Dad, you can't do this. Marcus was on his feet now, his voice rising. Those were gifts. You gave us access to those properties. I turned back to face them, and I let them see something in my eyes that I'd never shown them before: the cold calculation of a man who'd built an empire in one of the most competitive industries in the world. Nothing was ever given to you, Marcus. Everything was lent to you, with the implicit understanding that you would honor the man who made it possible. You broke that understanding. Now you're learning what happens when you take someone's generosity for granted. Emily was crying now, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of frustration, of someone who just realized they'd miscalculated badly. What do you want from us? She asked. An apology? Fine, I'm sorry. We're both sorry. Can we please just move past this? I sat back down and looked at both of them for a long moment. What I want, I said quietly, is for you to understand that respect isn't something you give when it's convenient. It's something you show consistently, especially to the people who've sacrificed for you. What I want is for you to explain to your children why the family trip is canceled and to tell them the truth about why. What I want is for you to sit down with your spouses and have a very serious conversation about how you treat family members who've done nothing but support you. I opened one more folder, the last one. And finally, what I want is for you to read this. Inside were revised estate documents, drafts that James had prepared. They showed a complete restructuring of my will, with the bulk of my estate going into a family trust that would be controlled by an independent trustee, distributed according to strict guidelines about family conduct and mutual respect. Marcus and Emily would still inherit, but it would be on terms that ensured they could never treat anyone else the way they'd treated me. But here's what they didn't know yet, the piece of information that would complete their education. Marcus was shaking his head. This is insane. You're punishing us because we wanted one trip without you? Do you hear how controlling that sounds? I almost laughed. Almost. Controlling, I repeated. Let me tell you about control, son. Control is what I exercised when you came to me 3 years ago, desperate because your restaurant was failing and you were about to lose everything. I could have said no. I could have let you learn that lesson the hard way. Instead, I gave you $140,000 to pay off your creditors and keep your credit intact. Control is what I used when Emily called me in tears because she and Tom were 3 months behind their mortgage. I could have offered advice and left it at that. Instead, I made 6 months of payments to keep you in your home. I leaned forward. I never mentioned those things. I never held them over your heads. I never asked for gratitude or recognition. All I ever wanted was basic respect, basic inclusion in the family I built. And you couldn't even give me that. So yes, I'm exercising control now. I'm controlling my own property, my own assets, and my own dignity. If that makes me the villain in your story, I can live with that. The meeting ended with Marcus storming out and Emily following in tears. I sat alone in my office for a long time after they left, feeling the weight of what I'd just done. It wasn't satisfying, not the way revenge is supposed to feel in movies. It hurt, but it was necessary, and I knew that somewhere deep in the pain, I'd done the right thing. 3 days later, Jessica called me. Not Marcus, not Emily, but Jessica, the daughter-in-law who'd written the email that started everything. Her voice was cold, professional. Richard, I think you're overreacting to a simple misunderstanding. We never meant to exclude you. It was just poor wording in an email. I let her finish. Then I said, Jessica, I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to really hear it. In my career, I've negotiated deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I've sat across tables from people who tried to manipulate, deceive, and outmaneuver me. I learned a long time ago to see through the words people say and understand what they really mean. So when you tell me this was a simple misunderstanding, what I hear is that you're hoping I'm naive enough to accept a convenient lie instead of believing what my eyes and experience tell me is true. There was silence on the other end. The Lake Tahoe property will remain closed to the family indefinitely. If you want to plan a vacation, I suggest you look at actual hotels. And Jessica, one more thing. When you married my son, you joined this family. That came with benefits you've enjoyed for 3 years, benefits that extend far beyond money. But it also came with expectations. One of them is that you treat me with respect. You failed. Make sure it doesn't happen again. She hung up without another word. I knew what would come next, the family pressure campaign, the mutual friends who would call to tell me I was being too harsh, the grandchildren who would be coached to ask why Grandpa was being mean. I prepared for all of it with the same strategic planning I'd use for any major business negotiation. Then something unexpected happened. 2 weeks after the confrontation in my office, my daughter Emily showed up at my house unannounced. It was late afternoon, and I was in my study reviewing quarterly reports. She looked different, smaller somehow, less certain. "Dad," said the doorway, "can we talk?" I set down my papers and gestured to the chair across from my desk. She sat down, and for a long moment she just looked at me. Then she said something I didn't expect. "You were right." I waited. "I've been thinking about everything you said, and I went back through the last 2 years in my head, really examined how we've been treating you. And Dad, I'm ashamed. We turned you into the enemy, into this obstacle we needed to manage. Jessica started it, but Marcus and I went along with it. We complained about you being controlling when you were just trying to stay involved. We got annoyed when you had opinions about family events when those were events you were funding. We treated your generosity like it was an obligation, something we were owed." She wiped her eyes. "I didn't come here to beg you to change your mind about the properties or the trust or any of that. You were right about all of it. I came here to tell you that I'm sorry, really, genuinely sorry, and to ask if there's any way we can rebuild what we destroyed." I looked at my daughter, this woman I'd raised, who'd grown into someone I sometimes didn't recognize. "Emily," I said carefully, "apologies are important, but they're just words. What matters is what happens next. What matters is whether you understand why this hurts so much, and whether that understanding changes how you act going forward." She nodded. "I know, and I can't speak for Marcus or Jessica, I can only speak for myself. But I want to do better. I want to be the daughter you deserve to have." We talked for 2 hours that afternoon. Really talked, in a way we hadn't in years. She told me about the pressure she felt to fit in with Jessica's narrative, about how Marcus had changed after his marriage, becoming more focused on appearances and status. She admitted that she was jealous sometimes, that I'd seemed to connect more easily with Marcus, and that she'd interpreted my attempts to include her as control instead of love. I told her things I'd never said out loud, how lonely I'd been since your mother died 5 years ago, how much I'd looked forward to being a grandfather, to having this extended family around me, how every rejection,
Every casual dismissal had felt like a small death of the dream I'd held for what our family could be. By the end of that conversation, something had shifted. Not fixed, not healed, but shifted enough that I could see a path forward with at least one of my children. But Marcus was a different story. 3 weeks after my meeting with Emily, Marcus sent an email. Not a phone call, not a visit, but an email. It was formal, almost legal in tone. He acknowledged that I had the right to control my properties. He stated that he'd found new office space for his startup. And then in the last paragraph, he wrote something that told me everything I needed to know. I think we need some space from each other. This has become too toxic, and I need to focus on my own family's well-being. I hope you can respect that. I read it sitting in the same chair where I'd read Jessica's original email, and I realized that Marcus had made his choice. He chose his wife's narrative over the truth. He chose pride over reconciliation. And while it broke something in me that I knew would never fully heal, I also understood that I'd done everything I could. Some lessons can only be learned through loss, and Marcus would have to learn his the hard way. The weeks turned into months. Emily and I rebuilt our relationship slowly, carefully. She brought the grandchildren to visit, and I made sure never to hold what happened against them. They were innocent in all of this, children who deserved to have a grandfather in their lives. Tom, Emily's husband, apologized separately, told me he'd always disagreed with how I was being treated, but hadn't felt it was his place to intervene. I respected that, even if I wished he'd spoken up sooner. Marcus and Jessica stayed silent. No calls, no visits, no attempts at reconciliation. Their children, my two youngest grandchildren, were growing up without me, and that hurt more than anything else. But I'd learned something important through this whole experience. You can't force people to value you. You can't make them respect you. All you can do is maintain your own dignity and
Set boundaries that protect your self-worth. Then, 6 months after everything started, I received a letter, not an email, a physical letter delivered to my house. The return address was Marcus's. Inside was a handwritten note, just a few paragraphs. Dad, it began. Jessica and I are divorcing. It's been coming for a while, and the situation with you was just one symptom of bigger problems. I don't expect you to forgive me immediately, and I don't expect everything to go back to normal, but I need you to know that I understand now what I threw away. I let someone convince me that your love was control, that your involvement was interference. I chose her version of reality over the truth I'd known my entire life. I was wrong. I am so incredibly wrong, and I don't know how to fix it. The letter continued, detailing how Jessica had isolated him, not just from me, but from several friends and family members, how she'd always needed an enemy, someone to blame, and I'd been convenient, how Marcus had finally seen the pattern when she turned the same tactics on his business partner, nearly destroying a friendship that had lasted since college. I don't want your money, the letter concluded. I don't want access to the properties or changes to the estate plan. I just want my father back. If you can find it in yourself to give me another chance, I promise I'll spend the rest of my life proving I deserve it. Your son, Marcus. I sat with that letter for 3 days. I thought about forgiveness, about justice, about what it means to be a father. I thought about the man I'd been at Marcus's age, the mistakes I'd made, the lessons I'd learned the hard way, and I realized that the revenge I'd taken, the justice I'd demanded, had never been the point. The point was always about respect, about teaching my children that relationships have value that can't be measured in money or property. They'd learn that lesson now, in the hardest way possible. The question was whether I could learn my own lesson, that love sometimes means accepting people back even after they failed you, as long as they're genuinely trying to do better. I called Marcus. When he answered, his voice was tentative, afraid. Dad? I took a breath. I got your letter, I said, and I think we need to talk, in person. Are you free this weekend? There was a long pause, and then I heard something that cut through all the anger and hurt. My son crying. Yes, he managed. Yes, I'm free. We met at a coffee shop, neutral territory. Marcus looked different. Older, more worn down. He'd lost weight, and there were dark circles under his eyes. We didn't talk about the divorce or Jessica or any of the drama. We talked about the grandchildren, about his work, about the things we used to talk about before everything got complicated. And slowly, over hours and multiple cups of coffee, we began to rebuild what had been broken. It wasn't instant. It wasn't a movie moment where everything was suddenly fine, but it was a beginning, and that was enough. If you've stayed with me this long, I want to thank you. I know this story isn't like the others, where the revenge is clean and complete, where the bad guys get exactly what they deserve. Real life is messier than that. But here's what I learned through all of this, and it's something I want everyone watching to understand. Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about setting boundaries that force people to recognize what they've lost. Sometimes it's about standing up for your own dignity, even when it costs you relationships you treasure. And sometimes, if you're lucky, it's about people learning from their mistakes and finding their way back to what matters. Today, Emily and I are closer than we've been in years. Marcus and I are working on rebuilding trust, one conversation at a time. I see all 4 of my grandchildren regularly, and I'm teaching them about respect, about family, about the difference between love that enables and love that requires accountability. The properties are still mine, but I've started opening them up for family gatherings again, on my terms, with clear expectations about how people treat each other. The trust documents remain in place because some lessons need permanent reminders. And Jessica? She's no longer part of our story, which is probably the best outcome for everyone involved. Some people never learn to value what they have until it's gone completely. I hope she finds whatever she was looking for, but it won't be at my family's expense. This story isn't just about one family's dysfunction. It's about something bigger. It's about the epidemic of adult children who take their parents for granted, who treat the people who sacrificed everything for them as if they're obstacles or burdens. It's about the dignity that every person deserves, regardless of age. It's about the fact that respect is earned through years of love and sacrifice, but it can be destroyed in a single, thoughtless moment. And most importantly, it's about the courage it takes to stand up for yourself, even when it means risking the relationships you value most. Because at the end of the day, a relationship without respect isn't a relationship at all. It's just an arrangement of convenience, and you deserve better than that. Your parents deserve better than that. We all do. So here's what I want you to take away from my story. If you're a parent who's been feeling undervalued, dismissed, or taken for granted, know that you have the right to set boundaries. You have the right to demand respect. You have the right to protect your dignity, even from your own children. And if you're an adult child watching this, ask yourself honestly, when was the last time you really showed appreciation for the people who raised you? When was the last time you treated your parents' time, property, and emotions with the care they deserve? It's not too late to change. It's never too late to rebuild. But it starts with recognizing that love is a two-way street, and family is something you build together, not something you just take from. I'm Richard Cole, and this is my story. Thank you for listening to it on The Mental Grand, where we believe that justice isn't about revenge, it's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. If this story touched you, if it made you think about your own family relationships, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Leave a comment telling me what you think about how I handled the situation. Did I go too far? Did I not go far enough? I want to hear your perspective. And most importantly, subscribe to The Mental Grand, because we share stories like this every week. Stories about real people facing real challenges and finding the strength to demand the respect they deserve. Justice always finds a way. Sometimes it takes time. Sometimes it's painful. But it always arrives. Remember that.